Okay, I think we're ready to start. My name is Ria Shinde of the Georgetown University Law Center on Poverty and Inequality. And first, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar for Black Herstory Month on creating curricula that elevate the leadership and experience of Black women and girls. This presentation is hosted by Schools for Girls of Color Learning Network, which you can find at www.schoolsforgirlsofcolor.org. We provide a secure platform for school system leaders and educators to learn about trauma-informed approaches for girls of color and engage in peer-to-peer learning. Here with me today are our fellow Learning Network leaders, Rebecca Epstein and Toela Piacas of the Center on Poverty in Georgetown, and Sydney McKinney and Aishatu Yusuf with the National Black Women's Justice Institute. Just a few quick reminders before we start. We welcome the use of the chat box to engage in the content of the webinar. After the presentation, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, links to the resources shared during the presentation. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to Kara Dubs through private messaging in the chat box or email me at lawpovertycenter@georgetown.edu for troubleshooting. If you'd like a certificate of completion, please email at lawpovertycenter@georgetown.edu. The email will be in the chat box. Now I'm going to pass it off to Sydney McKinney, who will introduce us to our presenters.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited and honored to be with you today. I'm Sydney McKinney, the Executive Director of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, and we co-lead the Trauma-Informed Learning Network with the Georgetown's University Center on Poverty and Inequality. Before we kick things off, I'd like to thank my incredible colleagues and our esteemed panelists for what I know will be an excellent webinar. And thank you all for joining us today for Black Herstory Month, creating curricula that elevates the leadership and experiences of Black women and girls. Led by our panelists, together, we will explore how we can infuse our classrooms with culturally and gender-affirming pedagogy, inclusive of the full diversity of our identities and experiences, especially the identities and experiences of Black women and girls, who too often are overlooked and marginalized in K-12 curricula. Our first panelist, Michelle Loveday, has been an educator for 20 years. Her style of hands-on learning, encouragement, and realness has helped students to overcome their barriers to success. Through her company, Loveday Educational Consulting, she shares information and ways parents can work with schools, advocate for their children, and how they can assist in creating a rich, diverse literacy environment at home and in school. She is passionate about schools being student-focused, equitable, and a place where all students feel that they are welcomed and have an adult they can believe in and who believes in them. And our second panelist is Sierra Kaler-Jones. She is a social justice educator, writer, scholar, and artist based in Washington, D.C. She serves as the Education Anew Fellow with the Communities for Just Schools Fund and Teaching for Change. She is also a PhD candidate in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Policy and Leadership at the University of Maryland, College Park. Through her research, she aims to highlight the brilliance of Black girls and how they use arts-based practices as mechanisms for identity construction, social emotional wellness, and resistance. She previously served as an intern and then fellow and consultant at the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans during the Obama administration. As an educator, Sierra has worked with preschool students, K-12 students, and college students over the past 10 years. So thank you so much for our wonderful panelists. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Michelle, to get us started.
Okay. So in this discussion, we just have about 20 minutes. And so it's one of those things that's always hard to give all the information in such a short amount of time, but I hope to leave you with ways that you can have your schools and environments that are culturally responsive for Black girls, especially as they are navigating this time. So what is culturally responsive teaching? Culturally responsive teaching is an approach that was coined by Gloria Lansing Billings. It empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using the cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So basically, the information that students come with you is information that you wouldn't have, and they are the gatekeepers of that information. They're the best people to go to for who they are in their classroom. A culturally responsive learning community is something that has 7 principles surrounding it. And you could take time each week as a teacher to focus on each of these in your instruction and in your building, in your classroom as leaders. The key thing is that relationships precede learning. No learning will occur if students do not have a relationship with their instructor or the leader of the school. And so the first step of that is that students are affirmed in their cultural connections. They know that the teachers get them and that the teachers see them. The second step is that teachers are personally inviting. They're warm, they're greeting them at the door, they're talking to students, asking them how their day was, what their evening was like. And then the third step are the learning environments are physically and culturally inviting. And that looks like books on the bookshelf that have characters that look like the students, Black authors that they could reach out and read and see themselves in the stories. These first 3 steps of building a culturally responsive learning community is what I call the front porch. So I'm a Southern girl at heart, even though I'm from the Midwest and living in Utah, but a good front porch still gets my attention. And it's one of those where you have a rocking chair, there's maybe, you know, checkers board playing that you could have. There's a drink that you just want to sit on. And it's probably one of the reasons why I go to Cracker Barrel to this day, even though I don't like the food, because the front porch is just so perfect. You go through the store and I just get caught up. And the next thing I know, well, I might as well eat since I'm here. That's what you want your classroom to be like. You want students to be like, I love the way the teacher has set up this classroom. I love talking to them. I just want to be in this room. And once you have them on that front porch, you then can go to the next step of reinforcing academic development and what they need to learn. And then you can also finally have the instructional changes to accommodate the differences in learners. We have a lot of young Black women that are under-identified for gifted programs and STEM programs. And if you truly have a relationship with a young girl and go through and overcome the bias of what you might have, you'll be able to put them into situations that would challenge them and spark interest that they never would have looked at otherwise. You then have a classroom that is managed with firm, consistent, loving control. Students know when you're always singling out the boys more than the girls or the Black girls more than anyone else. And when a classroom has relationships established first, you have a firm, consistent, loving environment. And then finally, interactions stress collectivity as well as individuality. When you're doing small breakouts, students feel comfortable talking to their peers, having discussions that they know that they won't be judged for their opinion, and having those crucial conversations as you move through dialogue in the classroom. And they know that I'm also a part of a team and that my teammates and my classmates are going to be cheering me on. And that cycle continues as you're establishing a culturally responsive learning community. So what does it do? Again, it establishes those relationships. It encourages diversity and building on what students already know. They know who they are. They know who they are as Black women, and it would embrace them, help them to be embraced in their own culture. And it would also communicate high expectations. Using a wide variety of instructional strategies would challenge our Black girls. We want to be able to have educators and leaders that have cultural competence. And one of the goals of Gloria Lansing Billings, as she writes currently, is what is culturally sustaining environments. And it's a practice. When you look at the range of the continuum, it goes from cultural destructiveness to cultural proficiency. And no educator, no person in charge of children wants to be destructive culturally for someone. So we want to be able to have cultural competence where our policies match what we say that we're doing. Looking at our school policies, the mission statement, are we including what we say we're doing? Are we understanding and operating and providing services for parents that make them feel welcome? They know where to go to have gifted testing. They know what to do if they do have to place their child on a 504 and it's not intimidating to sit through the meetings. The ability and will to establish authentic and effective relationships across our differences are the key things that establish what cultural competence would be. So I can't see you, but I would love for you to put in the chat after we finish this activity. I want to do a cultural toss activity. In this cultural toss activity, these are the items that you bring with yourself to every building. This is what you offer to your students, your family, and your community. So on a piece of paper, I'd like you to draw 6 boxes. And in those 6 boxes, you're gonna have some key things that you're gonna put. So I'll wait a moment for you to grab paper. It can be a Post-it, the back of a bill, or just write it down, whatever is closest to you. Okay, now that you have that paper, in the first box, I would like you to put your race and ethnicity. How do you identify on the census? Black, Latina, Caucasian. Okay. And then your religion and spirituality. What do you believe or practice? This could be something as simple as I practice hope, I practice kindness, or yoga, or specifically you have Catholicism in your background, or Baptist, or non-denominational. Language, this is what you speak most at home. Yelling does not qualify as that language, even though I know many parents are feeling that they use that. But the language of your family, would it be English? Would it be Spanish? Sometimes every once in a while, I even say that I put Black English vernacular, since that I am well versed in that as well. That is a language that I speak at home with my family. What is the language you speak most at home? And your life value. Now, your life value is a quote or a practice you instill in yourself and your family. Try again, never give up. In this family, we believe that love conquers all. What is that one statement that you go back to each day that gets you through the hard days of this last year of the pandemic? What has been your life value through those hard times? Your vocation, what you do. It's not necessarily, if many of you out here are teachers, it could be a means to an end. So for me, I am a mother first, and I'm only working so that I can make sure that my children have what they need to live and to thrive and be successful. So I would say my vocation is mom. And so that would be my vocation, but also it might be teaching is your primary focus, or you're a caregiver for elderly parents, or an aunt extraordinaire. What is your vocation? And finally, your possession. It is something of value. You cannot put a person or an animal because that is illegal, but a possession in the sense of a watch that maybe your grandfather gave you, a necklace that you can't live without. Mine would be a rocking chair that I was able to rock all 5 of my babies in that I want to pass down. So if the house was on fire, what's that one thing you want to grab? Okay, so now we are going to go to a learning task with these items that you placed on your piece of paper. And I do have to have a disclaimer that this was established by Gary Howard at the Reach Institute. This was prior to anything that we're currently going through in the last 4 to 6 years, but it does seem a little bit similar. The first thing is I will set up a scenario. For example, the scenario is our country is being taken over. And there's some militant people that are stepping in, and they're starting to force everyone out of their homes to where we have to live in community shelters at the end of our neighborhoods. So I need you, in the matter of 5 seconds, to select 2 boxes that you would give up as you move out of your house. And you have 5 seconds to do that. 5, 4, 3, cross them off, 2, and 1. Wonderful. So now we've adjusted to our life. In our community shelter, we've gotten to know neighbors that we haven't seen, even though they lived right next door to us. Things are going well. But on the outside of our government, things are getting worse. And they're now causing us to have to move underground as we are going to a new civil war. In that civil war, we are going to be placed into characteristics of things like the Hunger Games, into pods. And so as we move underground, you have to select 2 more things that you would give up. So please X out 2 more boxes, or they will take your family from you at gunpoint. And you have 3 seconds to cross things off. 3, cross them off. 2, 1. Take a step back for a second and look at the 4 items that you crossed off. If you could put them in the chat, what were those 4 items that you crossed off? I see that people are starting to put things in the chat, and I see race, language, vocation were the 4 things. Race, religion, language, possession. Okay. Vocation, possessions, race, and language. So that's the common theme right now, that we have race, language being able to be given up. Possession, belief. Okay, thank you. Thank you for putting these in the chat. We'll wait a few more seconds for you to all type them in if you choose. Okay. And I'm interested to see how easy it was, how hard it was, what were the first 2 that you gave up, and what were the second 2. But in that order, it looks like many are able to do race, language, vocation, and life value. Well, let me just tell you on this last step, go ahead and cross off the last 2 boxes. And what do you have left? You have nothing left. Many times when I've been doing this learning task, especially for myself, I've played this game a few times here and there, and there's one box that I don't usually cross off ever, and that is my race. As a Black woman, I don't think I could easily give that up. It's one thing that is all encompassing. I'm not just a woman, and I'm not just Black. I'm a Black woman, and that defines who I am. So to give that up would be really hard for me to do. And short of erasing myself, I can't give it up. It's literally with me everywhere I go. And I find that 90% of my participants that are people of color don't cross that off, very rarely. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves of what was easy to give up and what was difficult, what did we look at and say, well, maybe I wouldn't have given that up. And I was able to give up my belief because my religion encompassed my belief. And so there's rationales as to why certain things are easy to give up. I gave up my vocation because, you know, really in a few years, my kids are going to leave the house. So then who will I be without that? So there's rationales, but would you change anything if you could do this over again? And then coming from this, what, if anything, do our children in schools have to give up? How do you see this happening for our students? Is there pressure for them to be someone who they aren't? And for some students, you notice that it's a lot easier to give up other things than it is for others. I was sitting outside of my school when I was a principal before, and I was just sitting there watching students come in, observing how families were saying goodbye, just kind of taking a step in my own car, watching my school's day start. And I noticed a young girl that wore a hijab. She got out of the car, she kissed her mom goodbye, she waved, she stood by the tree. And then as her mom drove off, she quickly removed her hijab and put it in her backpack. Now I have to say, my school that I was a principal at, she wasn't the only young lady that had hijabs. We had many Muslim girls in my particular school, but probably I could count on my hand how many of those girls there were. So I made a mental note and I went and found her at lunch that day and I asked her, hey, this is my first time that I noticed you wore a hijab. Why did you take it off when your mom dropped you off? And she stopped. Oh, Mrs. Loveday, please don't tell my mom I did that. She would be so mad at me. And I'm like, no, that's a conversation you need to have with your mother, but why did you do it? And she's like, I just get so tired of all the questions people ask because I'm the only one in my class that wears it. And so in retrospect, she's the only one in 6th grade that wore it, even though the younger girls were wearing it. And 6th grade is already tough enough. And so, we talked a little bit about that dual identity of pleasing her family and the religion at home, and, becoming part of the American culture and what that looks like as a teen girl. And, would it be okay if we had a talk with her counselor, with her mom, and how we could ease that dual identity that she was establishing and trying to figure out. And so that's what we have to do as leaders of planning for inclusion and a welcoming culture and equity within our students. We have to think of those spirit weeks that we think are so fun. But if I were to do a crazy hair day, could she participate wearing a hijab? Could she do a crazy shirt day? What would that look like? So instead, for our school spirit day, we each got the students lanyards so everyone could wear a lanyard. That's a simple thing. Not everyone can buy a school t-shirt. So we have to plan for inclusion and a welcoming culture, because we have to teach and lead in such a way across so that more of our students across more of their differences achieve at a higher level and engage in a deeper degree more of the time without giving up who they are. So I'll leave you with this quote from Dr. King. Many people quote him and they don't really realize all of the things that he said in his I Have a Dream speech. He said, when we look at modern man, we have to face the fact that modern man suffers from a kind of poverty of spirit, which stands in glaring contrast to a scientific and technological abundance. We've learned to fly the air like birds. We've learned to swim the seas like fish, and yet we haven't learned to walk the earth as brothers and sisters. We have some work that we need to do. We have some things that we need to reflect on. And I know that together we can move forward for what's best for our students. Thank you so much for your time listening. And I want to turn it over to my co-presenter, and she's going to continue the discussion on what that would look like in social emotional learning.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for grounding us in the importance and the power of culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining pedagogy. As Michelle shared, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this looks like within the framework of social emotional learning, particularly how a lot of social emotional learning frameworks are co-opted or misused. And so I'll talk a little bit more about our work at Communities for Just Schools Fund to reclaim social emotional learning from harmful frameworks and management tactics that are centered in policing and control. Then I'll share some examples of activities that I've been able to do. I've been able to co-create with brilliant Black girls as a community-based educator and a dance educator. And then we'll lean into some art making. So if you have artistic utensils, a pen, a paper, whatever works best for you, I would invite you to feel free to bring those items into this space with you. So here as I begin, I would love to hear from you all in the chat box. And I have this question of what makes schools safe? And so I invite you to put your reflections in the chat box. What makes schools safe? And so as you are doing that, you might be asking, Sierra, what does it mean when you say reclaim social emotional learning? And I believe that culturally affirming social emotional learning is about reclaiming our relationships with ourselves, our emotions, our ancestors, our spirituality, our creativity, our land, and our relationship with others. It's about resisting colonialism and capitalism by knowing ourselves and honoring the unique cultures, languages, and legacies that we come from so that we can celebrate the humanity in others to fight for a world rooted in equity and justice together. However, what we see is the physical and psychological policing of Black and brown young people, specifically Black girls, has been a lethal tactic that upholds centuries-old systems of justice and oppression. Today, I am holding very close to me Kaya Roll in Florida, a kindergartner who was policed and punished for throwing a tantrum. I'm holding close 12-year-old girls in Binghamton, New York, who were strip searched for being giddy, for laughing, for expressing emotions. I'm holding close to me Grace, a 15-year-old who was sent to juvenile detention for not doing her homework during emergency remote learning in the middle of a global pandemic. Today, I'm holding close to me LGBTQ+ and non-binary young folks who are policed for not conforming to gender norms. And just a few weeks ago, a young Black girl was body slammed to the ground by a white officer at Liberty High School in Florida. Not only are schools physically not safe for Black girls, But SEL has been used as a tactic to emotionally, psychologically, and intellectually police young people. The most widely used definition of SEL includes manage and control your emotions and yourself in order to not only be successful, but to be valued, loved, and affirmed. Dina Simmons calls this white supremacy with a hug. SEL is also often discussed from a workforce development lens that emphasizes the importance of building the next generation of workers, developing 21st century skills and positive behavior to conform to societal norms to succeed in school and the workplace. Under this larger guise of how capitalism has manifested in the United States, the dominant workforce development framework of SEL encourages young people to stifle the very emotions that have long contributed to a rich history and legacy of resistance so that they can contribute to society as a worker. SEL has been about decreasing problem behavior, making young people conform to dominant behavior norms. Words like manage and control are words commonly associated with transactional business and hegemony. SEL has even been described, and I've seen this, I've physically seen this, as calm down and rewrite that angry email. Don't cry at work, don't cry at school. And I've seen this in classroom rules like maintain eye contact with the camera at all times and don't touch other people's property as examples of social and cultural awareness. These aspects completely disregard collectivist culture and cultures that regard eye contact as disrespectful. So how can we make social emotional learning centered in culturally affirming practices? In classrooms and schools, this could also look like forcing young people to practice mindfulness by remaining still and quiet with their eyes closed. Requiring young people to close their eyes can be a source of trauma. Mindfulness focuses our energy and attention on one task, which one could do in any daily task, such as through washing hands, taking a test, or even in having a conversation. You can approach it through mindfulness. In this kind of policing, it communicates the message that children who may need to move their bodies before finding a seat are not welcome or accepted because they are not practicing self-awareness. It is a form of control that polices the body, especially the Black body, to not take up space. And this is an example of how widely used frameworks can be co-opted and misused. When we ask young people to stand in a straight line, be still, don't talk, don't express emotions like anger that make people uncomfortable, we aren't asking them to feel, we are expecting them to conform to norms, which for me begs this question of whose norms are we adhering to and abiding by? Bell Hooks calls this the imperialist white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy. So let's talk about curriculum. If the curriculum is emotionally and psychologically violent to Black and brown young people, particularly Black girls, and completely erases the resistance of their ancestors, how are schools leaning into fulfilling the core competencies of social and cultural awareness? How can schools be places where young people can recognize their strengths if the curriculum is oppressive? How can we take perspectives, respect others, and appreciate diversity if the curriculum and the actual school infrastructure only highlights a history that presents the United States as the victor, rather than for the violence, the colonization, and the looting that this country was founded on? These are critical questions that we must grapple with when examining school curriculum as a tool for incorporating SEL into classrooms. This curricular violence, as Stephanie Jones calls it, makes me also think of what Bettina Love said when she called this the spirit murdering of Black and brown children by not seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum, but also in the ways that school discipline, policies, and practices are used and misused. SEL's policing is not new. Rather, it's another iteration of what schools were originally created to do: promote compliance and uniformity. But granted, this is not the case everywhere. And there are so many incredible social justice educators, administrators, support staff, counselors who are creating and sustaining classroom spaces rooted in the true promise of SEL. SEL can be a powerful tool for deep relationship building with self, with others, with community, with our passions, with ancestors, with land, when it's culturally affirming. With Communities for Just Schools Fund, our national network of over 60 partner organizations that include educator, parent, and youth organizers, we offered a remix of Castle's definition of SEL to fit community needs and desires. We put it up on a blank piece of paper, and we took our markers and our pencils and our crayons to the paper to offer this remix. You see it reflected here on the left-hand side. Historian Robin D.G. Kelly said, "Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down." And this is what we are building. This is what we are putting in place of harmful infrastructure. The definition reads, culturally affirming SEL is the process through which people of all ages recognize and process emotions. There are no bad emotions, they are emotions. And we need to get curious about them to deeper understand them, as all emotions give us the opportunity to really lean into the fullness of our humanity, to set and strive towards personal and collective goals and liberation while embracing failures as lessons, being free to make mistakes and being comfortable, feeling safe to make those mistakes. Going back to my question about what do safe schools look and feel like? Feel and show empathy, establish and maintain positive relationships with ourselves, our land, and our community, make collective decisions, identify the intersections between the isms, including colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, homophobia, cispremacy, linguicism, ableism, and all forms of oppression. In these conversations, we have to name it. We have to call it what it is. We can't keep brushing it under the rug. We have to name it. And then lastly, dream the world that we all deserve into being. I think about activist and writer Adrienne Marie Brown, who talks about that social justice work is science fiction. We are dreaming of a world that doesn't quite yet exist. So how do we use SEL as a tool for collective dreaming, for strategy to get to that world that we are all dreaming of? One that is rooted in love and justice, joy, and liberation. And I say, if it's not culturally affirming, it's not SEL. I believe the promise of culturally affirming SEL is restorative justice, not as a place of reaction, not as a reactive tool, but as a tool for relationship building from the start. It is a tool for trust building instead of school hardening, where school administrators, teachers work with students, parents, caregivers, and communities to co-construct a positive environment, increase sense of belonging for everyone. It includes political education, which includes storytelling and examining narratives. I believe that SEL provides the necessary skills to examine the narratives that have made up the fabric of this nation and of this world, particularly the narratives that have upheld anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and other forms of oppression. SEL offers a foundation for turning knowledge and empathy into action, as Rachel Cargill said. And here we recently released a radical report, AKA RADport, called Reclaim Social Emotional Learning, Centering Organizing Praxis for Holistically Safe Schools. You'll have access to the link to be able to view it if you would like. And through a year and a half of deep dive learning about SEL, through learning exchanges, site visits to places like Alaska to learn from the Association of Alaska School Boards and the cultural safety model that they've adapted from New Zealand, and Long Beach, California to learn from Californians for Justice relationship-centered schools, participation in convenings, Twitter chats, webinars, and more. What you see here on the screen is what we've learned, our findings from these conversations. The data here is real life experiences of community, of folks, of the people. But I believe for this kind of SEL to happen, there has to be a container for it, meaning that schools are spaces where young people, educators, administrators, parents and caregivers, community members, support staff, social workers, counselors, mental health professionals, coaches, and anyone who is a member of a school community feels safe to make mistakes, to try something new, to have reflective, critical conversations that can be uncomfortable. And as Michelle talked about earlier, the policies and the practice must actually match the promise specifically of SEL. I've had the honor and privilege of speaking with a lot of schools across the country about their social emotional learning work. And oftentimes the common question that I get is, okay, well then what curriculum do you suggest? And my first question is, what do your school policies look like? Do you have discriminatory dress codes? Do you have punitive discipline? Do teachers get the necessary support that they need to be well? And oftentimes the answer is no. But the policies, the practices has to match the promise. And we must commit to the deeply transformational work that SEL requires of all of us, because one of the things that we learned is that SEL works when we all do it with ourselves and with one another. It is a long-term investment to changing the culture of schooling. We can't just practice self-care and not embed it into the actual fabric of the school as a system. Unfortunately, it is not a quick fix, it's not a checklist, and it's not one box curriculum. And so with that, you're probably like, all right, Sierra, how do we do this? So here are some of my suggestions about how this might look. From my experiences, the ideas that I've gathered and collected over the years, from the inspiration that I've been able to gain both from young people and from other educators, from community folks who inspire me and push me to be a better and more reflective and more critical educator. And so in the other side of my work, I was able to co-create a program with high school age Black girls called Black Girls SOAR. SOAR stands for Scholarship, Organizing, Arts, and Resistance. And it was a virtual summer arts program focused on exploring Black feminist thought, Black history, leadership, activists, social change, and community organizing through a healing-centered lens. The first session explored Black history and the history of resistance through learning about Black women and Black artists, artivists, including Maya Angelou, Judith Jamison, Faith Ringgold, Audre Lorde, Destiny Watford, and more. In one of our other sessions, we talked about the meaning of self-care, of community care, and structural care, and we traced its roots back to the Black Panther Party, who told us the government doesn't take care of us, the healthcare system doesn't take care of us. We have to take care of each other. And so what does it mean to root our ideas and our conceptualizations on self-care in the radical practices of organizers? We also created arts-based work that captured the counter-storytelling tenet of critical race theory by using song lyrics as a foundation to write our own counter-narratives. So before we even started the program, I asked the young people, I'm like, what do you want to talk about? What should we learn about? What should we do? And they all said, let's talk about hair. I want to talk about hair. So we used Solange's Don't Touch My Hair and India Ari's I Am Not My Hair. We used the song lyrics from both of those songs as a foundation to write our own song lyric counter narratives. We also created dual self-portraits to speak back to the stories others have told us and stories that they've told about us. We also talked about dreaming our futures and using science fiction as a point of analyses. We talked about Afrofuturism and what it means to write ourselves into the stories of the present and the future, with inspiration by Octavia Butler, Janelle Monáe, and N.K. Jemisin. Throughout this process, we also learned how to do qualitative research together. We took the data, the transcripts from our conversations, and we coded it together. How cool is it to see our own words on paper, but then actually use that as data to say that this is knowledge that we produce and that we can share with others about our experiences. At the end of the program, they took the data that we've collected, that they've coded, and turned the themes from that data into artwork to share with the community through a community art showcase. And so these are just a few ideas of things that I've been able to do that I've learned alongside young people. And you can see some more ideas here with community agreements. We start out every conversation with what we call Ubuntu. Ubuntu is Zulu for I am because we are. We use that instead of the term icebreaker. An example of an Ubuntu might be, what's one word to describe how your heart is feeling today? so that we have an opportunity to check in with ourselves, but also check in with one another and see how others are entering the space so that we could best hold space for one another in that regard. We check in, we do circle keeping, we collect oral histories and testimonies from our loved ones. We are living through a global pandemic, continued racial injustice, a climate crisis. And so what does it mean to collect the stories of the people in our communities, the people that we live with, the people that we call family, so that we can see and pass those stories down? So let's try it. Let's try an activity that the young people and I have done together. It's called What My Hands and Heart Hold activity. And this is where I would invite you to bring your coloring utensils, your artistic utensils, whatever that might look like for you. There is no right or wrong way to do this. And so the instructions are as follows. I'd invite you to draw a hand so you can trace your own hand, or a heart. And then once you do that, I'll invite you to draw or write the issues in the world that you're passionate about, the things that you want to change on the outside, all around the outside of the hand or the heart. And then I'll share more instructions after you have a breath to be able to do that. And then, so just so that I have a sense of where everyone is at, since I'm not able to see you, when you feel like you're ready to move on to the next prompt, there is no rush, but when you feel ready to do so, I would invite you to put your favorite food into the chat box. I love the foods that are coming through the chat box. I see raw vegetables, fruits, school lunch. Did you say tacos? Perfect. We'll give it about another minute here, and then I'll share with you the next iteration. Oh, yes, pineapples. Beautiful. So when you feel ready, again, no rush. And this is something that you can continue to create even after we've left the space. I would invite you to, around the edges of the heart or hand, draw or write the people, places, organizations that are in your network that support you. Who are your people? The people that you know that you can go to with your biggest ideas and they will support you. And again, no rush, but just for prompting, when you're ready for me to share the next prompt, I would invite you to come into the chat box with your favorite color. Oh my gosh, yes, I love these glitter, yes. Purples, orange, purple, black, burgundy, purple, sky blue. Ooh, a lot of purple, very royal and regal. Beautiful. So for our next prompt, my favorite, inside the hand or heart, I invite you to draw or write your unique gifts, strengths, and talents that you can use or that you're already using to create change. And then when you feel ready for me to advance, I would invite you to put in the chat box either your favorite book or your favorite TV show. I love it. Yes, it's hard to pick just one. I do love all books too. These are great. Reshaped by Truth, A Different World, Big Brother, Bone Black, Memories of Girlhood, Lovecraft Country, Kindred by Octavia Butler, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and British Bake Off. Beautiful. And so this is how I would set it up with the young people that I work with in virtual learning. I know it's challenging, especially not being able to be with one another and to feel one another's energy. So even finding ways to offer them an opportunity to bring more of themselves into the space by asking questions about their favorite X, Y, and Z has made me and has made us feel a different sense of connection that we would be able to feel. The questions that I would ask in person, I try to ask in the middle of activities. And so how I would begin to pull this activity together is that I would ask young people to think about what are the relationships between the three things that you have drawn or written in your art. How can you use your network, your people, your community? One of my colleagues calls it your board of directors, a personal board of directors. So who are the people, the organizations, and the folks in your network that you can tap into to ask for advice or for feedback or to help support you. So how can you ask your board of directors, your people, or what can you ask them? And how can you use your unique gifts, talents, and strengths to make a difference in this area that you're really passionate about? And as we think about social emotional learning specifically, this creates space for young people to share those those interests with you, but also at the same time, it creates space to think about who are the people in our communities too that we can lean on to create the change that we want to see and that we want to create together. And one last thing about that activity is that I've been able to do that activity with children as young as 5 up through adults. So it is an activity that you, no matter what age group that you might work with or teach or support or be a parent or caregiver to, there are ways to facilitate the conversation or facilitate the activity in a way, as you can see on the last slide. These are examples of some of the younger students. So the 6, 7, and 8-year-olds and how they set theirs up. Might create space for different levels of conversation across the age span. And so in our RAD port, this is what I will leave you with here are our calls to action. So you see on the left-hand side some critical questions. How do people relate to themselves, relate to land, relate to their community? And our calls to action, what we would like to leave you all with is the importance of following and supporting organizers' lead and demands, thinking about community folks, parents, caregivers, young people, educators, following the leads and demands of community to know where to go. 2, fund organizing. This is specifically for philanthropy because Communities for Just Schools Fund, we are a donor collaborative. So we also are trying to push philanthropy in the way to continue to follow the lead of organizers. 3, eliminate policies that perpetuate the myth of racial hierarchy and develop policies grounded in belonging and brilliance. 4, assess how SEL's policing may show up in your own work. Being critical, being reflective is all part of the work, not of just being an educator or an administrator, but also of just being a human in this world. We are constantly growing and reflecting and changing and adapting. So what does it mean like to create space for ourselves, to be comfortable and to give ourselves permission to lean into the power of critical reflection as we grow? And then 5, center culturally affirming SEL practices in classrooms, schools, community policy, and philanthropy. And this all can be found in our RAD port. The link is at the bottom here, but I'll also share it in the chat box in just a little bit. So we wanted to create some space for, I call it a pause and reflect. So create space for a pause and reflect before we move into the question and answer portion today, as we think about what world do we want to dream into being together. Here is a QR code for a Padlet, and one of my colleagues is going to place the link to the Padlet in the chat box. And so we invite you to head into the Padlet either by scanning the QR code on your phone. The way to do this would be to pull up the camera on your phone and then place it up on your screen, and then it should take you directly to the website. So if you just pull up the camera app on your phone, you may be able to pull it up. That's not accessible to you, no worries. It will be in the chat box. Once you're in the Padlet, there are 3 reflection questions. 1, what was one thing new that you learned today? 2, what is something you learned and that you would like to apply to your work? And then 3, what reflections do you have about social emotional learning, particularly thinking about the beautiful presentation that Michelle had shared about centering and grounding this work in culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining practices. So what does that look like to you? What reflections do you have about how to make social emotional learning culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining? Please select one reflection question to answer now as a comment directly on the Padlet, whichever one is speaking to you. If you have time after writing your reflection, we invite you to read others' reflections. We'll take about 3 to 4 minutes to do this, and you will continue to have access to this Padlet. We would encourage you to check out some of the answers that people have reflected on after the webinar. We'll also send this as a follow-up. And then if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat box as we move into the Q&A portion. So again, we'll take about 3 to 4 minutes here for you to enter the Padlet, add in your reflections. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can play some music in the background, some lo-fi beats for concentration as you reflect in the Padlet. Thank you all for adding your reflections. Excited to continue to engage with you all through the Q&A. And thank you so much for indulging me in an art space activity. I always appreciate when I get to share space with folks, dig into critical conversation, and do it in artistic and creative ways as we all work together to dream the world that we deserve into being. I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues to lead us through the Q&A.
Thank you so much to both Michelle and Sierra for those insightful and truly interactive presentations. I think there's a lot of amazing information for us all to absorb and hopefully bring back to our communities. And so with that, we will be moving on to the Q&A. As Sierra said, we encourage you to use the chat box to write out your questions directly. And we will be keeping an eye out for that. Thank you.
Yeah, so if anyone does have questions, please throw them in the Q&A or in the chat. And until I see some of those, I'll kick us off with a few questions if that works for Sierra and both Michelle. So one, thank you both for those amazing presentations. I'm not an educator, and listening to you makes me feel so hopeful about the young people that will learn from both of you, and the teachers that will learn from both of you in this space. So, I think one of the questions that I thought was the interesting things about the conversation today is, Michelle, you talked about culturally sustaining. And Sierra, you talked a lot about that SEL is relationship building, right? And Michelle, you said relationships precede learning. So I guess the question I have for both of you, and I love this energy that happened today, one of the things that I have a question about is, when students come to a school or start a new school, they actually learn before they have a relationship with their teacher, right? You start to learn before that happens. So how, and I would love for both of you to answer this question, because I think you both might have similar and different takes on it, but how do you build a relationship at the same time as you're learning? Because student starts, then you start the relationship. So how do you do that? And then how do you do that specifically for Black girls, particularly if the teacher doesn't share identity, right? I think when you're thinking about teacher, relationship, this is science, right? Relationship is always better and quick, and happens more quickly when people share identity aspects. So what about when a teacher doesn't share that identity aspect? How do they do what you told them to do, which is build relationship that precedes learning?
Yeah, so one of the activities in time that we talk about when we're introducing schools to children, especially Black girls, is it starts at the front office. So if you have office staff that are right there, they probably don't look like our families either. And so we always talk about, are you smiling? Are you talking to them? Are you being kind? I had to address a few secretaries that would make people wait as she was talking to someone else, a teacher, and not acknowledge. And I'm like, what is that flow of PR, HR, when people walk into the building? They're immediate, and anybody physically in the building that lives there, so to speak, for those 8 hours will have to wait when we have guests walking into the building. And so it starts at that front office. And then for the teacher themselves, if you go back to that circle of the culturally responsive environment, the minute the students walk in, they're kind of gathering a sense of their new location. So for a white teacher, they could definitely display prominent books with Black characters, and they don't have to be, historical at all the times. There's books even for K3 with Lola Goes to the Library, about a little Black girl that's literally going to the library to get a book and read and act it out, and finding characters that look like them in all the spaces as they're lining the bookshelves, and not just for Black History Month, and asking, the young girl her interests, and talking with her, and working as a teacher to address any bias you might have. We all have bias, and we have to make sure that we understand what our unconscious bias is and consciously work to continually bring that to the surface, to have it aware, so that they can engage with students that are, relative. And, just talking to teachers thinking, well, the way that I taught the students last year, it doesn't work this year. Well, you have culturally different students, and it doesn't mean that they're any smarter or less smarter. It's just that you have to reach them in a different way. And so teachers really have to look at how they're presenting themselves. Are they sharing a little bit of humanity of themselves when they're having these crucial conversations? Are they taking a step back and saying to the students, you know what, I don't know, or let me find that out, or I'm sorry, I was wrong? Those steps of humanity that teachers say themselves out loud to students will bring that respect in from a student watching it. And then most importantly, how are they disciplining that child? Are there times where they feel like they're constantly telling the child to turn around, sit down, don't do that? And if they, they have to monitor themselves of how much they're addressing that particular Black girl in the classroom. I'll stop there and let Sierra finish up.
Yeah, that was so good. There were so many points where I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And I think, particularly for teachers that might not share the similar backgrounds or understandings of the world or experiences as their students, I think that it starts even before students come into the classroom or come into the community-based space. Just like Michelle led us through that critical reflective exercise, because education is such relational work, the power in knowing ourselves well enough to do exactly as Michelle Michelle was saying, to stand in front of a group of young people and say, I don't know, I made a mistake, so that they can really create even just the container for those relationships to happen. And I think additionally, it also comes in the daily practices, right? Like the daily interactions, from even just taking space at the beginning of class to ask how people are doing, or how is your heart doing today? What is something that you would like to share with the group? I know my students and I, we've always done circle keeping, not as something that is reactive, but rather as a tool for relationship building. So I make sure that every week there is some kind of space that we can create to either sit in person in a circle, but even virtually. I've learned from colleagues at Girls for Gender Equity in New York City, shout out to them, about the power of even doing this work virtually. So I know Training for Change is a really incredible resource. They have a lot of slides and presentations and tools, and there's actually a virtual circle keeping slide that they have where you can put students' names in a circle, and then I don't have my talking piece nearby, but let's just say my talking piece is this book. I might pass my talking piece through the camera over to Michelle, and Michelle would take her talking piece and then bring it close to her heart. So even creating spaces just for conversation, I think is critically important in this work.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And I guess I had a question. I'm gonna get to some of the questions that we have there, but I'm wondering why, as I read through them, will you both talk about how you build both culturally sustaining, or even your version of SEL through a virtual space? I mean, I think that we can't deny the reality of where we are today. And even as schools begin to safely open, or some schools who are not safely open are happening, how do you do that in a virtual space when you may have never even seen face-to-face your student? Can either of you talk about that?
So in many ways, we're virtual and in person here in Utah. And so one of the things that we've talked about is how they spend some time at the beginning of the virtual class getting to know the students. And students, no matter how old, they love to go and find things in the home. So it's just a little getting to know you. If they have a virtual background on and you say, find the cup that you like to drink on. And, they typically will have something around them. It's like, oh, I hold up this, and you can get to know what kinds of cups. Go and find your favorite stuffed animal. Go and find your favorite book, and just kind of send them on a scavenger hunt. Go and find your favorite writing utensil, and just to get to know who the students are in that virtual space. But then, as Sierra mentioned, spending time the first few minutes of doing a check-in. They may not want to say it verbally, but in the chat, tell me what's one thing that you discovered about yourself yesterday that you didn't know. What's one struggle you're having with this week? Especially with the civil unrest, we can't not ignore when something happens in the news. And so to go into a space after you watch a viral video of a man, being murdered with, his kneeling on the neck with George Floyd, you can't go into a space the next day and say, okay, boys and girls, we're going to learn. And you have Black kids sitting there like just traumatized. So it's okay to take a minute as a teacher and say, how's everyone feeling? I'm sure you've seen the news. Just put in the chat how you're feeling. And Sarah gave a perfect example of how just drawing a hand of like, what would you like to see changed? How that could just inwardly calm someone. And a final thing is just establishing a culture of what you want your virtual space to look like, and how that looks. Do you do breakout rooms and give them time to talk as students? I run a school just for Black kids here in Utah called Rise Virtual Academy. And so every Thursday we get together right before we talk about Black history. But before we dive into the curriculum and content, we spend a few minutes in breakout sessions chatting, and the students just sit and talk about their frustrations at being the only one at a predominantly white school around Utah, and having those moments of, I don't know if this happened in my class, maybe I'm seeing things, but I think my teacher doesn't like me. And then sharing experiences, they feel safe in that space to have those breakout sessions before coming back to learn.
Sarah, did you have anything to add before I add?
Yeah, I would just quickly add that so much of that is so incredibly important. And I think too, one of the aspects that's always been important to me is not policing students online. I know that there are a lot of schools that mandate that students have to have their cameras on, and you are a guest in their home, right? They are learning in their home or wherever they are, right? Wherever they are, whatever their living arrangements are, and they might not want to show what's in the background, or they might be helping out a younger sibling who is also trying to log in online. They also might be managing multiple tasks, but they've still showed up. And so being really mindful about making remarks like, oh, I need you to turn your camera on, because that to me is like an aspect of control. And that's why in the previous question, I had brought up this aspect of knowing ourselves well, because what are the reasons why we have went into teaching in the first place? And part of what we need to be really critical around is giving up this need to control and giving up a sense of power, right? Because learning should be co-constructed between both the educator and the young people. I learned so much from young people, things that I never thought about, perspectives and ways of understanding the world that I never could have imagined because it was outside of the scope of my understanding. So thinking about the aspect of giving up a sense of power and a sense of control so that you can really create a space where people feel comfortable. Another thing that I would offer is either offering some type of survey or like a quick feedback form where young people can share their interests or what they like, what they want to learn about, how they would like to learn about it, maybe things that they've seen in the news or the media that they want to talk about it. That way, sometimes students, I'm thinking particularly about Black girls who might be the only in their class that are grappling with national continued racial injustice on top of all the intersections of oppression that they might experience and might not feel comfortable sharing it in front of the class. So giving space for them to do it in a more private way, but that way, and that way you have an opportunity to engage with them. And then the last thing too, I think what Michelle said about making sure to create space to talk about social justice issues or current events is so critical. As an educator, there have been days where I'm like, curriculum out the door. And that's part of giving up the need to control, because if we go into the class and we're like, we got to get through this, and this, then you're not in a space where you can fully hold space for young people to process through those. So coming from a place of humility and coming from a place of intentional love, because we are also humans, and so we are also trying to process through a lot of these situations and experiences ourselves. And so this is where the co-learning aspect and giving up power becomes increasingly important.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the questions from the chat is, and either of you or both of you can take this, is how do we as administrators support the building of confidence where students, young ladies, particularly in middle school, need to learn how to take up space and not apologize for it? I would love your answer because I think adults need to know this too. So please tell it.
So as a principal, the one thing that I did a lot of was put the students in the forefront of leadership. We started initially with the Leader in Me with Franklin Covey. And so I started affinity groups. And so with those affinity groups, students were able to discuss the major topics that were occurring around their community and within the school, whether it be bullying or students in different apartments were being treated differently because of their income. And so I would have council where there was a representative from each grade level, male and female. And I would sit and meet with them and talk with them. And with our sixth graders, they were the student council leaders, and putting them in positions of leadership was extremely important. So if you have girls that are not stepping up and you know that they're in the classroom and they didn't apply for that student council, go and seek them out and say, have you considered applying? You should apply, and encourage them to apply. And once they get on that council, they'll then be in a position where they realize they can lead and people will listen when they have ideas. And I think that was key. Taking the time as a principal to sit with my sixth grade girls and talk with them was really important to them. They felt heard. When I gave each class chances to run an assembly, I know right now we can't do that because of COVID where we are, but just having them run the announcements, putting them in charge of the announcements for the week. What are they going to pick out? What are the topics that I need to say? Who's going to lead the pledge, and what's the order? And it becomes really important that you have student leaders that can shine and go around and and look at what's happening in the cafeteria and do some visual talks. We had weekly Tiger Talk is what we called it. And they put everything together, and then they would sit down, meet with me, and show me the outline and what they were going to do. And I think putting them in leadership positions gives them that voice.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm also thinking about policies. I'm thinking about policies because so much discretion is oftentimes left to administrators, to educators about what is appropriate and what is not. And we know, I'm thinking about the National Women's Law Center's report that they co-created with young people in DC where I live, that showed that Black girls, Black and brown girls are disproportionately affected by discriminatory policies and practices around dress codes. And so thinking about how can you, as Michelle was talking about having young people in leadership positions, how can you have young people be at the center of developing what those policies and practices might look like? Because right now we see that a lot of the policies have coded language. And I'm also thinking too, a lot of our partners at Communities for Just Schools Fund, community organizers are fighting for and winning police-free schools, because we know that there is a very troubled history with police officers in schools and how it affects Black students specifically, and then Black girls. And so thinking about reinvesting those funds into support staff, into counselors, into coaches, so that there are more people within the school building that young people can go to for love, for support, because we know that there are places in this country where there are more police officers than there are counselors, and there are some schools that don't have counselors at all. So making sure that the actual infrastructure, from policy to who is in the building to even the school building, right? What does the school building look like when you're able to be back in person? Does it look like a fortress? Is there not art on the walls? Are there metal detectors, right? So thinking about creating cultures of connectedness and community in schools so that we can put that in place. Like, that's what we're building towards, putting that in place instead of the harmful infrastructure.
Thank you. I have two more questions. One that I want to ask because of what you said. We can't leave a conversation without talking about school discipline when it comes to talking about Black girls. And I think one of the things that I have a question about, particularly for you, Sierra, is how can schools, which do all the time, say they both practice SEL and punitive school discipline? So how do you have both of those things that exist? And what would you say to people that feel as though they do both sufficiently and that they don't counter each other? Besides just laugh.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Laugh because, if we don't laugh, then we cry. And so that's how I approach it. But, as in my physical body, how I showed this, I mean, you can't do both, right? Because again, if it's not culturally affirming, it's not SEL, and that goes to the policies and the practices. Punitive discipline in and of itself makes young people, specifically Black and brown young people, specifically Black girls and non-binary, non-gender conforming young people, it is a way of pushing them out. Like, we've seen it. Monique Morris has talked about this extensively. I know that your work at National Black Women's Justice Institute does this work. Like, we see it. And I think that oftentimes there is a tendency to say that we can do both, because there is a belief, or at least the question that I get often when I have this conversation with schools is, how, like, what do we do instead? Like, it's that question of instead. Well, why do we even have to have that in the first place is my question, right? And that's literally the question that I ask, is why do we feel, again, the need to police, to punish and control? Well, it's because we live in a society that is based on police and control. And we know that policing is a tactic that is insidious, and it is folded into the cultures and how we operate in the school building, but also in the workplace and in the world, right? So one of the things that I'm really interested in exploring with social emotional learning is that I think that it can't just be about school. It has to be a complete, I'm all about abolition, right? So it has to be abolition because that's a form of, as Cornel West talks about love and justice, that justice is what love looks like in public, like that we need to do that in order for young people to feel safe, baseline safe, right? Because that's not just the physical safety, but it's also getting at the emotional, the psychological and intellectual safety. So we can't do both. And then as part of that too, in addition to policing, it's also the curriculum. Because when you look at a curriculum and it only talks about how your ancestors were oppressed, but not how they resisted, when it starts their history with enslavement, but it doesn't talk about all of the brilliance and the beauty that came before that. And then it, it puts our history in silos of this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and that's it, right? So thinking about how we can also talk about curriculum, and I'll share a quick resource. Teaching for Black Lives is an incredible resource that I use as an educator all of the time. Really illustrative stories and examples, great resources, great lessons to really transition the way that we are thinking about curriculum, pedagogy, and also policy. They just came out with a new book through Haymarket, Black Lives Matter at School, which makes a very clear and powerful connection between policies, practices, and curriculum and pedagogy. I could talk about that all day, so I'll put myself on mute.
Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Well, and Sierra hit the nail on the head, but I further would add, if you do have SROs at your school and they're there and you're beyond your limitations of having them removed, look at the training that they're going through. What are the discussions that they're having? And I went to an SRO training in one school district here, and I was just like, so that's it, that's the training, there's nothing else beyond that. So the training needs to line up with the policies that you're working on changing. And it needs to be the fact that you're there to assist and protect the students, not that the students are the people that are the bad ones in the building. And secondly, when we're talking about that, we have to take a point and just view that documentary, The Push Out, the criminalization of Black girls in American schools. Every administrator and SRO officer should sit down together, view that, then look at their data of discipline and suspensions and expulsions, and really take a turn on how things are being reactionary to some behaviors.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just because Sierra's in DC, the DC Police Reform Commission is currently doing some recommendations in which they're titling this Back to Normal, removing police from schools, right? Because I think what's important to understand is there was a day in which police were not in schools. There was a day that we didn't have, safety wasn't defined, right, by force. And so I think like this idea of like back to normal is this idea of like, they weren't always there. We've conditioned ourselves to think that's what safety looks like, which I love the question you first had, which is what is safety, right? And many people in the box said, feeling like they can speak, all of these things. No one said a gun, a knife, and pepper spray. So I think it's important to note that. And Sierra, you started this, but I think one of the last questions I'll ask is, who are the scholars that folks should be looking at? Who are the people writing this wonderful work besides clearly yourselves that people should be looking at in terms of social emotional learning or teaching for Black girls? Who should folks be reading and starting to craft their educational spaces from?
Oof. Do we have another hour? No, just
you got
kidding.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So definitely uplifting my sister, Dina Simmons, also Dr. Bettina Love. The Abolitionist Teaching Network actually has a guide for abolitionist SEL that has really incredible questions in it for educators, for administrators, and for community members. Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action, they're doing incredible organizing work. Of course, Monique Morris, the second book that she wrote, Sing Rhythm, Dance of Blues, as part of the Push Out conversation, is the foundation for a lot of the work that I do. So just uplifting that. There's really beautiful case studies and stories of what SEL looks like in practice when it's centered in the experiences and the brilliance of Black girls. I'll also share here too, if for those that are interested in history, historians just came out with a Black woman's history of the United States. Historians Dana Ramey Berry and Callie Nicole Gross. I'll actually be in conversation with them on March 8th through the Zen Education Project. We run a People's Historians online series. So if you're interested in learning more about the historical aspects of this work, definitely check them out. And then I know that there was a question too about teaching about voting rights and suffrage. So I'd also lift up Martha Jones and Vanguard about how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all. And then lastly, I'll also lift up Dr. Venus Evans Winters. Her work is also really incredible. There are so many Black women scholars that I could uplift in this moment, and really grateful to and for them for paving the way and for shining a light for all of us to be able to do this work.
Yeah, before I go to Michelle, Sierra, if you have a second while Michelle's talking, to drop the link of your talk that you'll be in, the conversation, can you drop that in there while Michelle gives us all of her wonderful folks that influence her?
Yes, please. I was just going to say, when and where is that going to be? The one thing that I would encourage, the books that you've listed, I won't even repeat. Those are amazing. There's also a book where it's that talks about things that my history teacher didn't tell me. And so reading through that, things that my history teacher did not tell me. That's one book that you need to go through. Also, Ibram Kennedy, he has How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped, which is also on a level that middle schoolers could read. Our history and how it's been erased. And Sierra hit the nail on the head when she said, we have it in silos and all you see is like the struggle and then that's it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, okay, I have to start this school for Black kids so that they can walk confidently in that. But another series that I would encourage you to listen to, which is available on YouTube, and it's just through Dr. Luke Wood, who's in California actually, which is called Black Minds Matter. He's had a 2-year series so far of it. You can follow it on YouTube and listen to the series. He brings in wonderful speakers. And one of the speakers, Dr. William Smith, talks about the racial battle fatigue that we feel and that students would feel, and the exhaustion that truly racial battle fatigue is a mental health crisis, and how the need for social emotional learning is key for our students as we constantly go through what's being in news. So those are some additional resources as you listen that you can find that on YouTube for his 2 sessions. He's done one last year and then one recently, and he'll have another one upcoming, and those recordings are available.
Thank you so much, both Sierra and Michelle. I want to point out a couple things for our folks that are listening, is that Michelle teaches and is taught in Utah, of which less than 1% of the population is Black. So Michelle is really thinking about this work from a place of young people and girls that are in schools that are predominantly don't look like them. Sierra lives in Washington, D.C. and is taught there, and is not necessarily doing the opposite, because we also know racial divides in D.C., but Sierra really is understanding from a different place of what it is to be Black in Black space, but also teach also teach young people. So I think it's important to think about both how their perspectives intersect, but also how they're thinking about these things in the different spaces that all of the listeners and people that are in school are really thinking about this. So I can't even say how lucky I am to be a part of this brilliance today with both Sierra and Michelle. Thank you both so much. For everyone that's listening, if you haven't joined the Trauma Informed Learning Network, please do so. You received the email for it, so please do so. Please stay involved with us, because we have amazing webinars like this, and please let us know other things you want to hear from us as we continue to build out this work and really get educators to understand how to teach and have Black girls in space so they can thrive. And then you'll also clearly get a recording of this in your email if you signed up to be a part of this. Again, thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. Thank you so much to both Michelle and Sierra. I can't even say how much I've learned today. So have a great day. We're 1 minute late. Bye, everyone.